Hi guys, welcome to People I Think Are Cool. I'm your host, Liz Reed, one part of the art duo Cuddles the Rage, and co-creator of the graphic novel Bites of Terror. And this is my podcast where I interview cool, interesting, creative people. Today on the show, I have guest Ray Harkins. He is the host of the podcast 100 Words or Less. The way that I came to Ray's work is I was kind of in a rut. I listened to a ton of writing podcasts, artist podcasts, just to stay inspired, to see like what other people are doing. And I was reaching a point where I was comparing myself too much, like, why am I not doing as much as the other people? So I decided to take a step back. And, it doesn't matter where you are in your career, like you're going to do that. So I wanted to find a way where I could still listen to creative interviews, but then not deal with the direct comparison thing with somebody in my field. And that's how I discovered 100 Words or Less. I fell in love with Ray's conversations. He is so intelligent, and you can take a musician that you love and listen to like 100 of their like interviews. And by that time, you kind of like know what they're going to say. You're like, oh, okay, he's going to answer it this way. And with Ray, he brings something new to the table every time. And he also doesn't ask any like weird, awkward questions. I feel like when you listen to like a lot of like celebrity interviews, you have those people who are like, I'm going to make it. I'm going to get that soundbite. And you're like, dude, like, don't do that. Ray is down to earth. And he is excited about the people he's talking to. He's a musician himself. And so he really understands where they're coming from. And above all, his podcast, 100 Words or Less, is about the story behind the people. Not so much like behind the music, but it's really about everyone's creative journey. So it applies to anyone who is looking to make something, period. It doesn't have to be specific. I feel like there is something that you can take away from every episode that Ray puts out there. So, guys, enjoy this lovely chat with the awesome Ray Harkins and go subscribe to 100 Words or Less. You will not regret it. Ray, I came across your podcast, 100 Words or Less, because I was just finding interviews with musicians because I've gone down this like rabbit hole where I'm in a creative partnership with my husband, and I listened to like all these art podcasts, and I was like, this doesn't cover what it's like to work with other creatives. and then I discovered that musicians often talk about that. And then I found your podcast, and I just kept listening and listening and listening, because even though I like music, I'm not like a huge music nerd, the way that you talk to people just immerses you into their life. So I guess I just want to start off with, you've been doing 100 Words or Less for 10 years, right?
I am like old school podcast person, because there are people who are just like, oh yeah, I started podcasting a couple years ago. And I'm like, when I look back at my feed, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I've been doing it for 10 years. So yeah, it's been quite some time.
Wait, so what got you started in it 10 years ago?
I fell in love with the medium of podcasting. It was probably in the mid 2000s. It was via a radio host, a dude named Leo Laporte, who does like a tech support show. This is like, it's super random, but like so I live in Southern California, and I mean, his show is syndicated across the country, but basically he's called the tech guy, and like people call in and are like, oh, my computer's broken. And he like, tries to talk them through whatever issues they're having. And then on top of it, he also talks about, technology in regards to like, this is what is new and cool. He then started to talk about on his radio show about this thing called a podcast, where, at the time you had this thing. It was like, I that term obviously wasn't in, the mainstream lexicon in the mid 2000s, but he was like, so there's this thing, a podcast, and like, you can download it. It's like on-demand radio or whatever. I don't remember exactly how he's articulating it. He actually at one point was talking about trying to rebrand them as netcasts, because he thought that pod was so tightly woven within the Apple ecosystem. So it's really funny. Anyways, I digress. I found his podcast. This is where you would have to actually download it to your computer and then put it over to your iPod. It was a process, and it was like literally like 6 or 7 steps to like listen to the thing. I actually started to, really, really get obsessed with that, because I was really interested in technology, and it was kind of scratching this itch. And so at the time, there was really only two types of podcasts. There was like, or three, if you want to be, specific. There was like This American Life, like public radio stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Comedy podcasts were kind of being a thing then, and then technology podcasts. And I was really transfixed with the idea of trying to figure out how to incorporate music within the context of the podcast universe. And then, fast forward a couple of years, there's a comedian named Mark Maron who does WTF with Mark Maron, again, one of the like luminaries within the podcasting world. I loved what he did in a similar fashion to how you described how I have conversations. Like I basically straight up ripped his idea off where I'm just like, I want to talk to these people in a manner that showcases why independent culture and music is so important, but at the same time do it in a in a linear fashion where you kind of follow along with the person's life, but at the same time speak about stuff that isn't like, how good is your new record? Well, how sick is your latest tour? Like no one is interested in that anymore, like straight up. And so I became transfixed with that idea of trying to do, like, for lack of a better term, an audio zine, even though I wouldn't be able to articulate it at that time, with independent music, because I felt like generically speaking, independent music kind of gets a lot of short shrift within, most music publications. Like, of course, there's alternative press, and obviously Pitchfork, the website, is able to, cover bands, but then there's a lot of bands that just get kind of written off as like kid stuff, where it's like, oh, like hardcore, like dudes yelling, like not that interesting. And so anyways, all of that, I kind of put that focus in the idea like, oh, this is what a podcast is. I can kind of execute this. I'm not an audio nerd, but I could probably figure this out. And it literally felt like starting a band, because I've played in bands before. So it was like the same idea where, like, I'm not asking permission to do this. I'm just like doing it, failing miserably most of the time. And then, eventually developing enough competency to be able to not only have discussions with people, but then, be able to make it not sound terrible. So that was kind of like, the seedlings that were planted in order for me to like, hey, I want to do this in some capacity.
What was it like reaching out to people in those early days? Because I do remember, I almost feel like it's the same, like working in television, like when digital media was coming about, and like, in that time, cable was king. And if you asked people to put content online, heaven forbid, for free, they'd be like, what? That's never going to happen. So I feel like with podcasts, it's the same way, where it's like, you kind of want to do radio, but it's not radio. And we like talk for longer than 5 minutes.
Right. Yeah. You don't have to deliver yourself in sound bites. Like I for sure remember when I worked for PETA, the animal rights organization, I went through some media training because I would do interviews for, like television or whatever. They just had to have a stable of people who were competent enough to, do interviews on whatever subject that a news reporter was looking to do. And I remember I was terrible at it because I know how to like speak and articulate myself, but I'm concise is not me. I'm not able to boil down a thought into like 30 seconds. And it was so bad. Like my media training, it's like, I just crashed and burned where I'm like, hey, if you're looking for more long form conversations, like I'm your man, but if you want me to do a TV hit, can't do it. But I agree. Like it is such initially all I did from a early sort of guest perspective was, pull in my friends, which, frankly, since I had worked in the music industry and played in bands for so long, I had a lot of these relationships and people trusted me to be able to like bring them on and not just like, like completely fumble over myself, even though I most likely did that a lot of the times, but they're my friends. So they weren't going to be like, Ray, you're terrible at this. And then plus I did have some experience doing like freelance writing for a lot of zines and magazines. So I knew how to do like construct an interview, roughly speaking. But then to be able to kind of port that over to audio was definitely, it took me a lot of learning. But then as I started to get a little bit deeper and, maybe have 40 or 50 episodes under my belt, that's when I started to maybe have publicists reach out to me and then have people who I didn't have relationships with. And that's when it became an interesting needle for me to thread of like, okay, I want this person to feel comfortable and express themselves, but I don't know them. So I don't have that shorthand of already being a friend. but then it's a tight enough music community where they're like, oh, well, he's, Ray is maybe friends with a friend of mine, so I know this is like is going to be okay. So there was a lot of that, but there was still people who I was, absolutely terrified to like ask for an interview or like go through the formal like press process. But then once the podcast became a more quantifiable commodity, that it's like, oh, this thing's known. It's not just like, oh yeah, this kid has a podcast that's on one episode. It's like, oh, there's a little more, for lack of a better term, professionality behind this. It became easier to get guests, but it was definitely, I leaned a lot on my friends.
That's awesome. Like, you do have to lean in on your network, even though it can kind of seem awkward sometimes like that. I can see you based on your conversations, like making sure that it comes from a good place. Because I always feel like if you're somebody who, knows somebody who can get you somewhere, it can always come off as like so like fishy to be like, hey, can you reach that person and have that person be if you mess up, that hurts my reputation with that person.
Absolutely. And there are many times where it's just like, when I have a person who is, considered popular or, more high profile, but I have a relationship with these people because I've like toured with them for years and, played with their original band or whatever. Like, I want to make sure that I'm still approaching it where it's just like, we're going to be friends and we're having a discussion. Like, yes, of course, I'm quote unquote interviewing you, but I don't view myself as a journalist. I'm not trying to, get something out of you to like get listens or clicks or whatever, where I just want to make sure that I'm painting an accurate picture of you via this conversation. That is not going to be like shoehorned into some other agenda. It's like, I literally want to make sure that people understand where you've come from, why this music is important to you. And because a lot of people look at anybody that has reached any level of success and assume that they've probably been, like airdropped in there. I mean, that's an exaggeration, but like most people feel like they are fully formed. And it's like, no, you don't understand. Like, they were terrible at their thing for a long time until they reached the spot where they're at now. And it's not to say that work should be, completely swept under the rug, because I think that's frankly where some of the most interesting stuff takes place, because that is the foundation in which they built off of. So yeah, it's always interesting to be able to, try to make sure you are not only representing that person appropriately, but then, yeah, you're not burning any sort of weird relationships where you're just like, oh, can you get this person on there? They're like, oh, I don't know about that.
Yeah. Hold on, I'm just going to grab a pillow real quick.
Please.
I'm like in my little David Litch fangirl pillow. Give me some back report. I'm recording in a different area than I normally do, so it's a totally different chair. But yeah, and I feel like with your podcast, with its popularity and everything, it is weird when you're trying to like build that community of creatives to tap into. Like, I always have felt awkward when people are like, okay, I'm going to write a review for your podcast and you write a review for my podcast. And then I'm like, no, you have to like genuinely like the stuff. You can't just like, I get the trade and you'll get like numbers or whatever, but then where does that take you from there?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. If you want to make sure that you are developing, an actual relationship with the people who obviously listen to the show, even if it's a one-sided relationship, that doesn't matter. Like, I'm so glad that people think the conversations I'm having are, worthwhile for them, whether it's like some of the most valuable pieces of feedback that I receive from people who listen to the show, where it's like, one, hey, I've known this person for 20 years and I've heard them reveal things about themselves that I did not know. And I'm like, that's awesome. Like, that's really, really cool, because, when you make friends as an adult, you're not like, hey, can you fit those first 20 years that I didn't know you into like a coffee? Like, you can't do that. And then the second thing is when people give me feedback that, hey, like I don't go to shows anymore. Like, I don't listen to as much new music as I used to, but listening to your show makes me feel more connected to this music. It feels like I will never forget this email from a guy who was like, a janitor at an elementary school in the Midwest. And he was like, yeah, I listen to, like when I'm cleaning the classrooms, like, late at night or whatever, I feel connected, even though I don't have the ability to go to as many shows as I used to. And I'm just like, dude, that is so cool, because again, it makes that person feel that much more connected to something that, as you get older, you have to work for the stuff that you would maybe just like kill time with as a kid. And so when I get those pieces of feedback, to your point, it's not just like, oh, cool, like, can you leave a review on Apple Podcasts? I'm just like, oh, when I get these emails, I literally just like file them away because I'm like, that's great, man. Like, I will never forget that email. I mean, that was literally set like 7 years ago, and I could still anecdotally pull it up.
No, it's true. Or sometimes, like, I've interviewed somebody and they've connected with somebody from their past. And I'm like, oh, you guys have found each other now. But to your point, when people were saying that, you pull stuff out of people that they've never heard before, that is completely true, because the first episode that I listened to of yours was the Jim Adkins interview, because my husband introduced me to Pass Through Frequencies. And then I was like, wait, artists are, musicians? Like, that was when I got the whole, like, they can understand a creative partnership, and the balance there. So through listening to him, I was like, okay, I want to hear more interviews from him about what his creative partnerships have been like. And so I got to the point that, like, I knew his answers. And I understand why they do that, because that's fair. Like, it saves space in your brain, like, and you're going to be asked the same thing 1,000 times. You really can't pull, like, new stuff out of that. But the conversation that you had with him, it made me stop, because I was like, this is an actual conversation. Like, these aren't the answers that I can, like, oh, he's going to say this. It really felt like you did your research, which I'm surprised how many people don't do their research. Yeah. And it's almost like you preemptively knew that if he was going to say, same thing with Jonah. I always say his name wrong. You said Matranga. So I've always said it wrong as Matranga. So it's Matranga. I'm sorry, Jonah.
He'll be the first to be like, it's fine, you can mispronounce my last name.
I know. I've interviewed him too. And so when I listened to your interview with him, I was like, all right, let's see if we hit some of the same stuff. We hit one of the same things, but it was still different stuff. So whenever you feel like one of those answers are coming on, are you cognizant of that? And do you try and steer it?
Yeah, I try to, especially when something that I've always tried to keep in my mind is where, because it's easy to try to do, especially the thread that I try to pull, where it's like, like born and raised, like sort of biographical information, but not make it so stuck in the minutia of like, oh, this is exactly how you would answer anybody else asking. Like, I don't want to ask Jim Adkins where he got Jimmy Eat World as a band name. Like, I know that. So like, maybe I would frame it in the form of a question where I'm like, oh, so I know you got Jimmy Eat World, via this, ridiculous drawing that, one of your friends did or whatever. And so I try to, if I know something, I try to make sure that I'm including it in a question. So that way a person who maybe doesn't know that will still get their that piece of info in their head, but then I'll be able to frame it in a way that is going to kind of loop back around, where it's like, oh, they're going to answer this differently. It's not just going to be the, just the facts, ma'am. And so, and then I also I never try to have people as part of a press cycle. Even though a lot of times I get hit up by like, hey, this band has a new record coming out, we'd love to have them on there. And I try, like, it's not because like my podcast is a special snowflake and it needs to be like its own separate thing, but I don't want to be, one on a list of like 3 interviews they're doing that day. And only reason being is because it takes me longer, frankly, to get them comfortable with a conversation rather than a straightforward interview on like, let's talk about how sick the riff is on the 3rd song of your new record.
I think part of that too is also being a good listener. So whenever you were talking about, doing the PETA interviews and like you can go on forever, that sounded so foreign to me in a way because you, in your interviews, you actually are listening. Like, the worst interviews are when somebody's talking over.
They're just
not
waiting
actually
to talk. Yep, yeah, exactly. Totally.
Yeah. Did you have to learn that?
I definitely did, in the sense of there were times like I think of an interview that I did with Jordan, the vocalist of Newfound Glory, who has done millions of interviews. I have a personal relationship with him. I mean, I've known him for years as an individual, but then like he married one of my high school classmates, so like there's another weird connection there. But we were having a discussion, and we were talking about how his parents got divorced at I think he was, I don't know, like maybe 14, 15, at an age where that is going to be a really difficult thing that you're going through. And so he was, expressing himself and talking about how difficult it was. And then, I shared a story of mine, like my parents got divorced, when I was young, et cetera, et cetera. And it was one of those things where I was trying to focus on just like obviously making him feel less alone. Like when a person exposes themselves and talks about something difficult to you, the human instinct is to be empathetic and be like, I'm sorry you went through that. Like, it's terrible. And so it's a matter of addressing a person and listening to what they're saying, and understanding that you're trying to not just meet them in the middle, but you are trying to make sure that this conversation feels appropriate, that they're not just sitting there bearing their soul. And then you're like, all right, moving right along. But it's funny because then I had people saying you're injecting myself too much into the interview, because people are obviously used to the structures of interviews being like, this person will ask questions and then maybe have a sentence or two follow up. And it was just, so, it doesn't necessarily address the question that you're talking about, but I really try to be mindful of am I injecting myself too much in these discussions? But at the same time, I'm like, if I remove myself from these discussions, it becomes, it just becomes less personal to me and less meaningful to me. And then in turn, if I do have a relationship with the person, it kind of strips that whole hey, I don't want to get too inside baseball where I'm like, hey, remember when we toured together, did that? I don't care about that. Unless that's the whole focal point of the discussion. But I want to make sure that people are hearing the, empathy that you can bring to a conversation, while you are obviously listening and being able to make sure that you're going to pivot and be like, oh, wait, there's something you said in there that I want to pull on that thread. I want to make sure that I'm understanding what you're saying or whatever, because if you're just waiting to talk, then that is, that's it. You're just waiting to talk. You're not listening.
No. Yeah. And, I think that's why people open up to you so easily, because you do share a piece of yourself. It's like a give-take thing. And another thing that I noticed is that even though you have toured professionally, you're not quick to mention that every second. That's what I found in these interviews with musicians, that they're quick to be like, well, when I was on tour. And I'm sure it's fun. My husband, he was the merch guy for Fairweather, and so he tells me his tour stories. Sure. And I love them. But when he has a conversation and somebody says on tour, that's not the first thing that comes out of his mouth, totally. It's still focused on the person. And so why? I'm just curious. I guess it's just natural to try and connect with people and oh, I did the same thing. But why do you find for yourself that if that does come up, how do you handle that organically? Does it go back to it's about them and not about me?
Yeah, I do try to it's interesting because for people that I don't know and I have to build frankly an immediate rapport with them, I do try to lead with the fact that or not lead, but make sure that this person understands kind of where I'm coming from, where it's just oh dude, I've played in front of -4 people in Omaha. I've totally done that, I have done these things that you are doing and and still continually do. So I'm trying to establish my credibility without sounding like that douche that's talking about their high school football days or whatever. But at the same time, I want to make sure that my experiences are not obviously overshadowing theirs, where I'm just oh, we sold out this, really cool 400 person room. And then I'm like, well, I played a 500 person room. It's it's that's not relating. That's just a weird competition at that point. And so I definitely, like I said, for the people that I don't know, I try to build that rapport within the first, honestly, 15, 20 minutes of a conversation, to make sure that if they, are not, and this is going to sound so egotistical, but they're not aware of my credentials, but if they're not hey, they don't know that we have a lot of the same shared experiences or similar friend group or whatever, then they're going to maybe just look at me as a person who did not have those similar experiences to them, which is fine. You could still have a good conversation and not have those rooted levels. But when I'm able to bring that different perspective of understanding to the interview, that's when people are going to, like you said, maybe open up a little more to where it's just like, oh, dude, you played that same hole in the wall? Like, yeah, me too. Like we've done that, that bathroom's terrible or whatever. Like just those little shorthand things that make it, easier for them to understand that you've experienced the same things.
Yeah. Have you ever gotten 930 Club cupcakes?
I never have. I am aware
shame.
of their existence. I know. I've never, I've never played there, but I went there. I can't remember who I saw there, but great club. But yeah, nope, never got the cupcakes.
No, for sure. So I wanted to move into kind of like podcast structure in a way, just because you're so familiar with it. You basically eat, live, breathe.
Yes, podcasting. Yep, exactly. Yep.
Some of my favorite recent episodes have kind of been like off the music topic. Recently on podcasts, and then another one on records. But to me, I'm just calling it soundtracks because I love soundtracks. I think you mentioned that too, and I was like, okay, I'm into this. I started like taking notes.
I love it.
So how do you decide, balancing in something a little bit different? Even though, because like the podcast one, there's always like a little bit of a root in what you are doing, because you do a podcast and you're doing podcasts, but it's like to the right of it.
It is, yeah. I honestly, some of my favorite, not only guests, but honestly, yeah, some of my favorite guests are the people that I like to call secret punks, where it's like, these are people who from the outside would maybe not seem like they have an experience with independent music or DIY culture. But when I'm able to, like, I'll use, again, Roman Mars as an example. 99% Invisible is like one of the most popular podcasts around, and it is an incredible listen. And I heard him do interviews where he kind of like sprinkled some sort of like punk knowledge, where he talked like Black Flag and Misfits or whatever. And I was like, this dude probably knows what's up. And so I just remember hitting him coldly up. And most people want to talk to him, obviously, about his podcast or about his successful Kickstarter or whatever. There's this common things that people want to speak to, people in positions of power about. And so when I came at him, I was like, yo, you want to talk about like punk and hardcore? He was just like, wow, absolutely. He loved it. And I like being able to show, especially now, because this subculture and scene has existed for a long period of time, to where people that have grown up with it and can still be responsible adults and do things that are outside of the context of just like, I'm playing in a band forever, which is fine if you do that. But that culture and that train of thought has permeated everything now. And so when I'm able to pull people from, kind of random and disparate places that no one would automatically assume, I love doing that, because then, it can push people's trains of thought, if they're younger, to be kind of like, oh, like, my life doesn't have to be this like one linear path of like, I'm just going to be this type of person, or I got to play in a band, or I got to run a record label. It's like, no, you can do whatever. Like, you can be a comic book artist. You can do all of these different things, that as long as you're applying the same principles that you learned from this weirdo scene, it's going to pay dividends in ways that you would never be able to come up with. Like, like keeping merch and like, account and like all that stuff. You're not learning accounting, like, even though you are like, but you can't describe it when you're 17 or 18 years old. They're like, I'm learning some basic principles of math. You're just like, no, I got to know there's 10 shirts. I've sold 8. How many do I have left?
Yeah.
And so I like being able to kind of usher my audience along, to be like, hey, here's this, this person who might not be playing in a band or running a record label, but has this connection to something that they feel so powerful about. Like, I'm really excited because next week I'm interviewing a professional gambler. This is a woman who's made a living off of horse racing and betting on horse racing.
Dang.
But she's put out records. She has tons of experience within the punk and hardcore scene, but it's like, no one would ever like think of that or know that. And so I heard her do an interview where she like kind of mentioned stuff like that. I'd like to have on and highlight, to be able to show a wide range of diverse interests that are all still rooted from the same scene.
Mm-hmm. No, that is true. And I like it when, do you follow Criterion Channel at all? Or there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, yeah, like when they have people outside, like I think they had like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar like talk about being a cinephile. I'm like, what? You're a cinephile? I only knew you for basketball. It's just like
Totally.
you feel connected to those people too. Like you have like you said, like a common language, and it's just weird that it makes me almost sad. Like when you see, I'm always big on like, well, I'm freelance, but when I had coworkers, like wanting to know what they were interested in. Oh, what? Actually wanting to know them. And then
Yeah, exactly.
I feel like you don't know the person sitting to the right of you until you have that conversation that you might be obsessing over the same thing outside of like water cooler Game of Thrones talk or something. And so I feel like
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think that you hit on something that, you know, the older I get, the more passionate I get about like finding out what people are obsessed with or nerds about, even if it's something that I have no kinship towards. It's just like everyone has to be obsessive over something, in my opinion. If you're just kind of like whatever, then it's just like, you know, we won't have a common language. We won't be talking about being horribly obsessed with maybe, you know, the minutia of things that just don't matter. And so I completely agree with you. Like when you find a person that's just like, dude, wow, you love stamp collecting? Like, let's talk about that. Let's talk about what that looks like. And when people get excited about that and they express that side of themselves, it just makes you that much more endeared to that person, even though you may not care about stamp collecting. You care about the passion that's behind that, you know?
Yeah, yeah. Like I felt endeared to one of your episodes when you guys were talking about shelving for vinyl. That is a daily conversation in this household. And figuring out how do you manage your collection? Do you let it grow? Do you try and pare down?
Do you cut minimalism? It off? Yeah, that is a serious first world problem, but it is a problem.
Yeah, you could watch many YouTube videos on that too.
Absolutely, for sure.
With the future of podcasting, I do feel like a lot of it is going towards kind of like the video, expanding into video and kind of being both. Since you, again, like live in that world, where do you see podcasting going?
I think video, the video podcast is, basically just a mechanism for discovery, because it is much easier to get things algorithmically recommended to you via YouTube, So it's like I have personally posted, not every episode of my podcast on YouTube, but just like, a static image, an interview with this person. And, I'm able to get where it's like a person is trying to find an interview with someone from Propagandhi. Like my interview will pop up on YouTube, and then hopefully they will either subscribe to the show or check out more interviews, whatever the case may be. So I think video, while it's an important component to making sure that people understand like what podcasts are, and like the further penetration into pop culture, I don't think like, is that the future, like the pivot to video scenario? It's like, no, like podcasting will always be, rooted in audio, and there will always be things that you can do in audio that you obviously can't pull off from a video perspective. Like I'll use an example. There's that podcast Lore hosted by Aaron Mahnke. It's a spectacular show, and that got ported over to, Amazon Prime or Amazon Studios or whatever, picked it up for 2 seasons. And it was okay. Granted, this is coming from a person who liked the podcast. So, I technically wasn't maybe the audience for it per se, but it was one of those things where it felt like it was cool to see these shows quote unquote come to life. And it's very similar to Tales from the Crypt or whatever, where it's an anthology series. Each episode can kind of live on its own, and it's, spooky stories or whatever. But it just, it fell flat. That's honestly why they did it only for 2 seasons. And then Amazon was like, okay, we'll move on. So I think that there is something that is inherent to podcasting, but then there are certain formats that are obviously more interesting to be able to do from a video perspective, whether that is obviously fiction, and taking these true life stories and then making it into a television show or a movie. To me, the most successful translation from podcast to, for lack of a better term, video, is a series called Homecoming. And what was it on? It may have been on Hulu. I can't remember. But anyways, it got ported over. It was a very successful podcast, and then they did 2 seasons of it. The first season was spectacular. Julia Roberts was in it. It was really good, and they did the show justice. But again, that's fiction, and that's something that realistically, the idea of translating audio into video, that's what people do in writers' rooms, even though it's not audio per se, like they're writing these ideas down, and like it's that's essentially the path of making movies and everything else visual. But I think there's something that's always going to be special with audio and podcasts. So I think the future of podcasts will always be audio, and it will just be easier to discover shows. Like, when you're able to Google podcasts, and like in your recommendation engine of choice, it will recommend podcasts to whatever subject you are also Googling, And so I think that's something that Google, I know, is focusing on, where the discoverability. And I think over the next 3 to 5 years, you'll see a lot of innovations in regards to that, because I think that's what most people are having difficulty navigating. Like when they find something that they're interested in from a podcast perspective, they're like, could I have more of that? And then sometimes the only way they're able to find that is like randomly, or maybe a friend recommends it. And so I think that's where a lot of the space is going, of just people making sure that content is easily accessible for as many people as possible. Like the open ecosystem, I'm a huge advocate for, and like not putting stuff behind paywalls and all that sort of stuff. So
yes.
Yeah.
I understand the Patreon thing, but I know that for us in our business, we've always been kind of, not against it, but just it hasn't been our cup of tea. Sure. Because I do want content to be available for people, and same thing, like if in your band, like go buy merch, like you say, right. Go to a concert, support them in that way versus trying to deal with Patreon, and then especially if you're not good with keeping up with stuff, like the coming soon can only take you so far.
Absolutely. So, you actually have to deliver on whatever you're promising.
yeah. Before we wind down, there's one specific episode that I wanted to touch on with you, and I'm gonna grab my notes just because I'm gonna get it wrong.
No, it's fine.
Souvenir with Tim Riley.
Oh yes, yep.
I love that episode because I was prepared to hear more about music, and it was more about his life, and I think that's very important for people that I'm going to say, go listen to 100 words or less.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Because even if you're not, totally into music, it is all about the people and the stories that make up their life, and, that then lead to the creativity. With that interview in particular, where he talks about growing up and then health issues, did you know that you were going to get that intimate?
For him, because I know him, I knew that I did want to address his health issues, because I know that he not only is passionate about speaking about his experience, so I did know I was going to go down that road. And then there are certain times where I have conversations where a person reveals something about themselves and I am not aware of, and then so I kind of feel out in real time whether a person is comfortable going down a rabbit hole. I remember a conversation I had with vocalist of this hardcore band called Blacklisted. The singer's name is George Hirsch, and like he was arrested and he spent time in jail, and I knew that, and I knew he doesn't talk about that. But I was able to bring it up in a way where like he's not going to talk about his time in in jail, like in the intimate details. But it was the most that I'd ever heard him discuss about that topic. So, and I'm not friends with him previously. So I was coming into this cold where like he didn't need to trust me talking about this at all. He could have just been like, not going to talk about that, right? And so I do know, and frankly, the way that I've developed the show, people sometimes come to me to be able to express themselves in a way where they're like, hey, I want to talk about this. Like one of the most popular podcasts that I've ever done is with the vocalist of this band called Census Fail, with a guy named Buddy Nielsen. He's been on my show a couple of times, but one time he came to me where he was like, I want to talk about my sexual identity, and I want to talk about like my drug abuse. And I want to really, be honest about this where I haven't in the past. And so he didn't need to do that with me at all. Like he could have gone to, alternative press or anything else, but he was like, I want to be able to have the space to be able to talk about this because it's nuanced, you know, it's not just like a cut and paste, like, hey, this was my drug abuse, like in like a sort of Motley Crue way. This was like, oh yeah, this was like dark. And this is the space that I went to. So I think because I have kind of planted those seeds, so to speak, that people do feel comfortable, you know, talking about stuff that they may not have the space for in other places or whatever. Or if they do have the space to talk about it, it's from a more sensationalistic way where it's just like, look at this person's journey. This is crazy. When I'm like, yeah, it's crazy that you went through this, but like, let's talk about what that looked like. And so I'm glad that it, you know, can resonate with a person like you who are just like, yo, I've never heard of this band at all. Like I have no clue about this person, but then to be able to hear about their experience, you know, makes it more not only this human more identifiable, but like you said, the kind of the creative process that comes out of that and the art that could be created from, you know, these dark places, which obviously many of us go through.
Yeah. And I'm the way he described himself, I'm so different from him, but yet feel so connected through that story of like, how can you not feel for him?
Yeah, absolutely. And I like being able to paint those pictures for people to be able to like have those identifying markers where you're just like, oh yeah, like to me, the most valuable thing that a person could maybe take away from any of the episodes they listen to is be like, you know, especially if they're like music fans, they're like, hey, I hate that band, but now I know where that person comes from. I love that.
Totally.
And it's like you don't need to like the art that the person creates, but hopefully you can understand that where this person is coming from is not too dissimilar from where you came from or some of the stories that you have shared. So I think that is a real important component for people who are just like writing off like, oh, this band sucks. It's like, okay, that band could still suck, but here's where they came from. And it's probably pretty similar to where you came from as well.
Yeah. It's almost like the opposite of cancel culture where like...
It's like it's subverting, yeah.
Like the person, yes,
totally. And I think that is really, you know, this is like total old man on the porch stuff, but like I really attribute that, I guess that willingness to, you know, look at people in that way where I'm not just like writing them off based off of the music or the art that they're creating. I think that's because it was like when I was attending shows at the height of my show attending career, it was like, you know, just in the infancy of the internet. And, you know, I just was consuming all styles of music. Like I worked at a record store, obviously played in a band, like it was doing all these things and I had all these different inputs. And I didn't care if I was necessarily going to like, you know, an indie rock emo show because I liked these bands and then also went to like a metal show or went to a punk show. Like I didn't care. I just liked the bands. And so I was getting drawn to that, even though I will self-identify as a hardcore kid, like, you know, vegan, straight edge. Like there's a lot of these things that are just like quote unquote common within that scene. But I followed where my own music taste went. And then I didn't just write bands or people off because it was something that I didn't understand. I was like, well, that's maybe not for me. But we probably have similar upbringings, or you know, they're common. We have more in common than we probably have different. And I think that sometimes can get lost in just the, you know, quick take reaction of like listening to a band song and just being like, oh, they suck, completely write them off. It's like, well, I mean, you can write their music off, but there's probably some interesting stories there.
Yeah, or the best thing you say is, are you in a band?
Yeah.
Are you trying to make something?
It's true. It's true. That's definitely a corner you can stand on. We'll be like, well, then you put out something if you don't like it.
The best thing, just even hearing you and the conversation that we're having now, it just made me realize through your interviews is that you are not judgmental. And not only in your interviews, I feel like as a person, even when you were probably working for PETA, it seems like you probably weren't judgmental then. And that was probably hard to do. No,
I'm very, I would agree with you. I definitely don't have, I have opinions about things. And I think that I am not afraid to express those opinions, but there are so many things that I don't agree with in regards to what either people believe or philosophically, but I will still try to meet this person in some common ground level. Because I do think that that's the space where you are hopefully going to be enriched by that person's experience, you know, provided they're obviously not, you know, white supremacist sixth street, like, I don't need to meet those people in the middle. Like we're fine. They can stay far away from me. But then there's a lot of other, nuances where it's just like, yes, like I self-identify as a Christian. Like, do I find value in religion? Like elements of it, but then there's a lot of it that I don't agree with. But, some of my best friends are atheists, and it's like, that's fine. Like we have different beliefs in regards to that, but I'm never going to look at them and invalidate their conclusions based off of my experience. And I think that it's just served me well in my own personal life. And then, has been able to help, I guess the discussions that I have, because I really am trying to come at people and understanding where they're coming from, even though I may not agree with them,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that just means so much. As somebody who was sent off to a Southern Baptist private school for college because I needed to learn the hard way. I wish I would have met more people like you.
Well, thank you. I remember, like, you saying that triggered a memory of, like, I remember I was in a community college class on, like, it was like interpersonal communication or something. It was, whatever, this like very touchy-feely class. But, and you spoke a lot about yourself in these classes as you were, meeting other people and everything, and publicly. And I remember there was a person where, I talked about like how I was straight edge and like didn't drink and all this other stuff. And so there was a person at the end of that class that like came up to me and was like, after getting to know you and understanding like, what straight edge means to you, my opinion on that whole philosophical movement was changed. Just because like came from a place that you were non-judgmental. You'd be like, yeah, you're not going to like slap the beer out of my hand. You'd be like, I don't do that. And like, I mean, we can still hang out, and as long as you're not like literally killing yourself, I'll be in a safe enough place to where I'm not going to do that to you. But I do agree with you. Like when you whatever it's the saying, you catch more flies with honey or whatever. It's like when the things that you're doing seem approachable, people are going to be genuinely curious about it and interested in it, as opposed to like, I'm just going to put up walls between you and me.
True. Okay. Last question for you.
Of course.
Absolute last, because I'm so curious.
Yes.
Why is your podcast called 100 Words or Less? You always say, you're like, obviously it's more than 100 words.
Yes, I do.
So what's the meaning?
So there was a saying that was in my head where it's like in 100 words or less, in school, you were supposed to write an essay or whatever, like something where you were being concise, you were, getting your message across with, 3 or 4 sentences or whatever. And so like that was a common saying, of a certain age and era in school. And so I knew for myself, like I just always like to be sarcastic and funny. So like I was like, okay, well, for 100 words or less, like no one's going to take it seriously, because they'll look at like how long an episode of a podcast is and be like, clearly this is not 100 words or less. Like, what is this? But then it was also just a joke on myself where like, if you have a discussion with me, like we're going to be in this for the long haul. Like this isn't just a quick 10-minute conversation. Like we're in this for a while. And so it was twofold why I named it that. Was, one, just kind of like the saying of like in 100 words or less. And then 2, I just thought it was funny. And that was basically it. There was no real, I didn't want it to be kind of like just so on the nose where it was like, you knew what the show was about even before you listened to it, even though that's like, like West Marketing 101 where you should do, but I just didn't do it for this particular name. But once I started to do it, and I was just like, this is cool. And like people do ask me where it's like, what's the meaning behind that? And it's like, well, yeah, it's not 100 words or less. I can tell you that.
Oh, it's why I clicked on you, because I wanted to know what it was. And also it matches your style versus like, I don't know, music, podcast, whatever. You probably would come up with some cooler name than that, whatever. But it let me know that it feels more conversational.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, and that was an unintended, benefit of me not being so on the nose. It does get people to just be like, what the heck? What are you talking about? Like 100 words or less?
Like poetry or what?
So is this in a haiku form? Yeah, exactly. People don't know exactly what it actually means until they actually click on it and listen to it, and they're like, oh, this isn't 100 words or less. This is just like a quote unquote normal podcast. It's like, yeah, exactly. So
with a super nice guy. I still can't get over like your conversations. It's like being a fly on the wall. And so thank you so much for opening my mind to different musicians and different types of music. And it really means a lot to me because I mostly discover things through my husband. And now I'm the one going to him like, do you know this person? And mostly he's like, yeah. But I'm like, but do you know this about them?
Dude, I honestly, I love that because it's like to have a person like you who, like you said, enjoys music, but is not like, super hardcore nerdy about it. It's really meaningful that people find enough to latch onto to be able to listen to. And frankly, trust that it's like, hey, who I'm going to put in front of you, like you'll probably be interested in some capacity. And that, to me, that's like, mission accomplished. Like I could probably stop now because like you just told me this, so we're good.
Well, since I always go on longer, but it reminds me of documentaries. Like you can take a subject on a documentary, like Spellbound's a good one. Like who is going to be like, I'm going to sit down and watch a spelling bee? You're like, you're going to sit down and watch this whole movie and
Absolutely.
Just quote it forever.
Right. And have a really strong opinion of it. Yeah. It's like, those are the things that will be really meaningful to you and have the most impact, where you don't expect to care so much about the thing. And then once you're through with it, you're just like, I care a lot about this.
So much.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Ray, for your time. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for caring and listening and being so, thoughtful in regards to your questions.
Oh, thank you. That means so much, especially coming from you.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much to Ray for being on the show. Go subscribe to 100 Words or Less. My personal favorite episode is the one with Jim Adkins. That is really one of the episodes where I feel like he pulls new information out because I listened to Pass Through Frequencies, but the podcast that Jim Atkins did during the pandemic, which, by the way, I recorded this still during the pandemic and we're still in it, but, it was like in the heart of it before a lot of like sweet vaccines are coming in. But I loved that interview. That's when it really was like, this guy is doing something different. So go check out that Jim Adkins interview, Jim Adkins from Jimmy Eat World. At the end of every show, I recommend a movie. Since Ray is a musician, I wanted to group something together in that world. I love music documentaries and I love wrestling documentaries. There's something about those two genres that, in day to day, I'm not really that into them. But then once you get like, the drama going of like the camera in their face, there's something about those two fields where it's just magic. Because I feel like with musicians and wrestlers especially, they are hardcore passionate about, pursuing their dreams. And I don't think you see that in any other documentary, whereas like wrestlers especially, like they will bleed for their dreams. Today, I'm recommending the documentary Dreaming in America, which follows the band Lucero, where they do I think 250 shows in a year. It also follows them as they're recording their record, Nobody's Darlings. And if you don't know, there's all this stuff coming there. If you don't know Lucero, go check them out. They have a very gritty noise. Well, that's when I first started listening. I was like, it's very gritty noise. But then after watching the documentary, I just fell in love with their music and especially just knowing their journey. I think that's the key for so many creators is once you know their story, then you feel so much closer to them. And that's why I think it's the perfect fit with Ray Harkins interviews for 100 Words or Less, because that's exactly what he does. He tells you the story behind the creator, which if you're a creator yourself and you feel like you don't have a story, you do. Just pull back, think about it, and, share your journey with people. Ooh, that got a little serious there. All right, guys, I will see you next time. Bye. Double hand wave. I am one of those double hand wave people. I can't help it. It's so cool. Bye.